O heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and dwell within us, cleanse us of all stain, and save our souls, O gracious one. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology, joined by returning guest Jonathan Prejean, and we're going to be talking about Protestantism and anarchy, a response to Gavin Ortlund based on an article that Jonathan did in response to Gavin Ortlund. It is there in the show notes, so you can go and click a link, click on the link and visit it. It's Crimson Catholic blog, and the article title is Gavin Ortlund, Apostle of Anarchy. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. Jonathan, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Good. Glad to be here, Michael. Thanks for having me back. So this article that I wrote, what happened is my friend Joshua Charles had gone back and forth with Gavin Ortlund on how to properly interpret the fathers on things like ecclesial authority and that sort of thing. And that, we've seen that happen. There's always going to be those discussions. But what kind of interested me is this particular engagement pointed to an area where it's just fundamentally getting the concept of the church wrong, at least from a Catholic position. And the denial of what the church is from the Catholic position is, from my perspective, really a fundamental denial of how the kingdom of God is organized, what the government is, how it functions. And so to highlight that, I basically use an example from secular government. So that's kind of where this came from. And so the point that Gavin was raising was his position was essentially, nowhere is it taught that there is such a thing as what he calls post-apostolic ecclesial infallibility.
Okay.
And he's hung up on this idea of infallibility. But what he doesn't realize is infallibility from the perspective of Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, anything else, is really a consequence of the fact that the church has divine authority. So really the question is, did God establish a divine authority?
Right.
And the other piece of the divine authority is, if revelation is closed, then how is the divine authority of revelation maintained?
Yeah.
And he's essentially taking the position that it's plausible that there's no government that can authoritatively rule on the content of divine revelation. And so if there's no government, then that's what we call anarchy. And there's a reason everybody realizes that doesn't work. You just can't have a public society that has no government, where each person decides what the law is for themselves, that is going to function in any kind of reasonable or orderly way. And when we talk about, a lot of people, when they talk about private judgment, what they don't like is private judgment in scripture. They don't mean intellectual judgment, like you make determinations about what's true and what you know and things like that. Everybody's got to do that. There's no question that you can do that. What they mean by private judgment is basically appoint yourself on law. Right? So you're the final, there's no government, so you decide what the law is for yourself. And that's essentially where I went with this secular analogy. And by secular analogy, Gavin's point was essentially, well, the authority of bishops in the church was a later development, not a much later development, but a slightly later development, that bishops actually had authority in the church and this structure of sort of episcopal authority and jurisdiction. But if you look back at the history, if we take a completely secular example, so like the United States government, everybody knows that the government of the United States is the government of the United States. founded in the Constitution. Well, when it was founded, the Constitution talks about a Supreme Court, but doesn't say anywhere that that the Supreme Court is able to say what the law means, essentially interpret the Constitution, that they can make constitutional decisions. It doesn't actually say they have the power of judicial review. That didn't happen until a number of years after the Constitution. That was a Marbury versus Madison, where Chief Justice Marshall said, yeah, what they meant by the judicial power includes the ability to interpret what the law is. But if you went back and said, okay, well, I have to find something in the Constitution that says exactly that they're going to do this thing and have this authority, you're not going to find it.
Yeah.
It was based on historical considerations, but the fact that they made that ruling and nobody argued with it, and that was accepted as the way things are going to go, meant that it was not something that came in completely out of nowhere. It's not something the Supreme Court was trying to force on everybody. It was the reasonable understanding of what was going on. Well, if you view the apostolic succession as a government, then it's really no different. Yeah, this idea of jurisdiction, and especially the mono-episcopal jurisdiction, did come up later. And the evidence is that in places like Rome, where there are multiple bishops, they sort of all govern together. There wouldn't necessarily be, one jurisdiction. And that was fine. There's nothing wrong with having multiple bishops govern together. But the territorial jurisdiction came later for good reasons, and based on the authority that was given the episcopate when the church was founded. So that's just a completely natural development, just like judicial review was a completely natural development of having a Supreme Court. So when Gavin is saying, okay, there's no, we don't have explicit evidence for this exercise of authority, that's not really supposed to be the question. The question was there a government established? And if there was a government established, then those sorts of developments are exactly what you expect. And especially if those developments are made, everybody agrees with them, there's no real dispute about it, then that's not a legitimate basis. You can't argue from silence to say that that's not a legitimate power. So what that basically came down to was, if we're in this situation where he's claiming that there was no government founded in the kingdom of God, that's the dispute. It's not about what the fathers are saying or what evidence you're looking for. It's about that fundamental question: who's in charge in the kingdom of God, and how is this supposed to be run? And also, from my perspective, I think that we as Catholics aren't defending our own intellectual position well enough. Because traditionally what we say is that based on the motives of credibility, you should be able to have moral certainty that the church is the church. And there are a lot of things that we have moral certainty about. For example, we have moral certainty that the government of the United States is the government of the United States. Maybe for whatever reason, some weird thing happened and this is all a conspiracy and whatever. But you don't worry about that, right? Moral certainty is good enough to live your life in most cases. And so when we're in that situation where we know what the government is, no one doubts this, right? If someone says, well, that's not the real government, there's some shadow government, you look at that person like they're crazy. But when we do the same thing in religion, everybody knows who the Pope is, right? It's not a surprise. I mean, I take that back. There are a few people who deny it, but the response to that is kind of, well, that's a little crazy, right?
Yeah.
Not something that's normal. That's something that's off to the side. Well, that's really the same thing when you're questioning what the government of the church is. There's no question about that. And if you look through the fathers in terms of the apostolic succession, everybody agrees that the bishops that were in the apostolic succession, that is, bishops appointed by bishops, are the people who are in charge of the church. That's just how it works. And so in Protestantism, you're really in a situation where you're denying that kind of common sense understanding that we all have about government for the kingdom of God. And the question that I'm asking Gavin is, why? What's the basis for being wildly skeptical about the governmental structure that we have in the church versus, like I said, saying that there's some other government, or we don't have a government at all and it's totally private judgment and every single individual gets to say what the law is. And so I think that it's a really simple and straightforward argument. And it's actually something that Perry Robinson, my Orthodox friend, and I sort of agreed on, and he's been talking about this. It's like having a Supreme Court is not something that's unusual. Being able to make these decisions is not something that's unusual. Having some sort of government when you've got rules that bind a bunch of people is not unusual. Yet from the Protestant perspective, it's like, oh, we're all supposed to be on our own. It's completely in our own conscience. And how does that even make any sense? So I think his argument that there's absolutely no evidence for the apostolic succession is just nonsense. I think it's exactly the opposite. Why on earth, looking around, would you think that there's no government at all in the church, that God didn't establish a government, and that we don't have anything to go on today in terms of being able to look around and say who the government is? So the response that gets given for a lot of these sorts of discussions is, well, the government of Israel made a mistake.
Mhm.
The government of Israel was fallible. They went off the reservation in terms of following divine commands. They went away from divine law. They clearly made a lot of errors. And my response to that is essentially, well, that's the difference between revelation being closed and not. Because if God says, well, if things go wrong, then I'm going to specially intervene. I'm going to send a prophet. I'm going to, give you a sign. I'm going to, appoint kings, whatever it is, these offices, judges, prophets, things like that. I'm going to send somebody to help you out, or deliver some special divine revelation to get you guys back on track because you went off. Once divine revelation is closed, that's not available anymore.
Mhm.
God said, this is one revelation for all time. The incarnation was it. The life of Jesus was it. Jesus is the fulfillment of all past revelation, and you don't need anything new. So you're not expecting people to come in, and that's sort of fundamentally the problem with revelation and the Reformation is, where are these guys coming from? God never said anything about, I'm going to be sending new special revelation to reform things and get people back on track. You have to go with what you had in the first century, and that can't change. If that changes, then what God established wasn't adequate, and the revelation of Christ wasn't adequate at that time. So they've essentially got two problems. And the two problems are, first, they're asserting that there's no government, which makes no sense. You couldn't even maintain revelation that way. And then if there is a government that is established later, or if basically self-establishing a government works, then where's the divine authorization for their pastors and their elders? So if you look at the whole thing, that's essentially the argument. It's really simple, that if you expect a government in the kingdom of God, and you expect revelation to be closed, so this is just a self-sustaining government, it runs on its own, infallibility is really just a consequence of that. You don't need to be looking for where's the infallible authority. And, we all know that there are complications on exactly how ecumenical councils work, how the papal magisterium works, non-infallible magisterial teaching, these things. There are things that you're going to have to work out, just like there are things that we had to work out with the United States government on what counts as judicial review, where they can. These are things that just get worked out. But the big picture is, that's clearly the government. So if you need to figure out things, that's great. But start with the fact that's the government, and then you can work on figuring it out.
Very helpful. So let me ask you one follow-up here. You say infallibility is a consequence of this government. How so? Can you connect the dots for people?
Yeah. So faith is kind of an interesting situation. because it's an intellectual habit, but it requires assent of the will. So that's not something that, there are things that you have moral certainty about just because you know they're true, that you can have natural certainty about. But faith is sort of different because you have, essentially you've got a heart obligation there.
Mhm.
And so part of that submission is recognizing the authority to which you're submitting as religious authority. And you can have an incomplete level of submission. So, for example, Protestants recognize that Scripture is inspired, so they have some degree of submission to it. The problem is it just doesn't get brought together because you can't. There's no normative understanding of what it means,
Mhm.
right? And so, if everybody's on their own opinion, they can't achieve unity of faith because they're not submitting to any common religious authority, and their submission to that authority doesn't fit within submission to everything else. So that is one unique thing about religion, is that it's not just knowledge. This element of submission to the law also directly relates to your faith and your knowledge about the faith. But that's essentially the thing. And I wrote an article on that's way too long, but on divine revelation as normative authority, because that's basically it. It's something that you're assenting to based on divine authority behind it. But the fact that it's the same divine authority behind all of this is what makes this unifying. And if you look at like Father Garrigou Lagrange on Revelation, he talks about your faith is in the God who reveals, who neither deceives nor is deceived, right? So you know that it's true. So ultimately, it's divine authority that you're recognizing in all of this. But the question is, how do you get yourself into the correct intellectual position, and how do you find something that's adaptable to your intellect so you can look at that and say, I'm going to submit to it? And so again, the fact that there's that submission, and we've talked a little bit about this too, the fact that there's that submission, that's the part that gives the church its indefectibility, right? The reason we can't fall away from the faith collectively is that the church is built in this way where we have submission to authority that preserves our ability not to fall away from the faith. And so when we talk about the infallibility as being a consequence, that's based on the authority structure. So if you got an authority structure where you're responding to divine authority as individual Christians, then it has to be trustworthy that divine authority isn't going to send you off the reservation in terms of the faith. And so that's when I say that it's a consequence. It's not something that you necessarily look for. You don't have to say there's this authority in this church, and this authority is going to have this jurisdiction and this level of infallibility. You don't have to see that. All you have to see is that they have divine authority and understand what their role is in preserving the faith. And once you recognize that, you don't need to have explicit, spelled out understandings of exactly where everything, how everything works. We can figure that out later. But this is the place that has the authority, and this is where we're going to work it out.
Let me also ask you this. The process of coming to believe that the magisterium has authority seems maybe a little different than once you've arrived at that conclusion, how you then respond to that magisterial authority. Can you maybe walk us through those differences?
Yeah, sure. So, so when you're talking about how you get to faith, that's this. They call it the motives of credibility. So you're inquiring, right? You don't know yet, and
Right.
you're not omniscient, so it may take you a while to figure this out. So that's kind of how that goes. And then once you're in the church, that's the thing is once you achieve a level of what should be moral certainty, but it may even be a lower level of certainty, but to be rational about it, you would be going through the motives of credibility. You look around, you say, okay, this is the church, this is the source of divine revelation. I am morally certain that if
Mhm.
I assent to this, I am assenting to
Yeah.
what God's commanding for me.
Yeah.
So that's it. Is when you get to that point, you give that assent, and then you say, okay, well, that's what I'm assenting to. I'm assenting to this authority. And there can still be questions. That's the
Sure.
thing. You still might not perfectly, you're still not omniscient, right? You can
Yeah.
still make misjudgments about what the magisterium is saying. You still may misunderstand, but you're in this framework where it's like, I recognize the authority of the government. I know it's not my job to say what the law is. So I'm going to do my best to listen to them. And
Mhm.
it's just like trying to be an obedient citizen, trying to follow the law. Not everybody's going to be an expert. In fact, the law is so complicated that there is almost no one who could be an expert across all the different areas of law.
Mhm.
But at the same time, you say, okay, well, I recognize the government has this authority. So if I don't understand everything at every level, I can still function as an obedient citizen. It's the same thing with faith, right? If you recognize where the authority is, you can just try to be a good Catholic. And yeah, you might make mistakes, but the purpose of having the authority isn't so everybody has perfect knowledge of everything, because you can't. I mean, we're not omniscient, but it does give you something that you can use to orient your religious submission around.
Do you think that some Catholics are struggling with that, with assent to the magisterium? Um,
Yeah, so this is, I think, what has happened. And I saw, some remarks online about this, and I thought it was good. I think what has happened is there is confusion on this private judgment thing.
mhm.
What's really meant by private judgment is making yourself your own normative authority. Like,
Mhm.
I get to decide what the rules are for me.
Mhm.
That gets confused with epistemic authority, and that's like, is someone reliable? Are they trustworthy? Are they? And look, the magisterium is to some extent, but it's that's narrow, and it's in the context of how the magisterium functions as an organ within the church. And I think that because people just really, when they're going through the seeking process, they kind of follow this. Well, I have to figure out what to believe, right? Like, I have to
Mhm.
figure out everything to believe, and I have to understand this. And it's kind of like this intellectual system for them.
Mhm.
And they go through trying to prove this intellectual system. And the problem is, when your theory doesn't work, you find an anomaly for your theory, it becomes a crisis of faith for them.
Yeah.
And that's where I think a lot of people are, is I think they have this theoretical understanding of what the magisterium is supposed to do, as opposed to this practical understanding. Like, they're the guys in charge, they're the law, they're the government. We're supposed to obey them. And they get in this, well, I've got to demonstrate from first principles that everything they do is in line with this thing. And it's the same thing as, with the United States government. Like, there are political crises every once in a while, where it's like, can the president really do this? Is this law unconstitutional? Whatever, those kind of things. And if you say, look, we know they're the government, so we'll figure it out, then that kind of gives you space to be able to think it through, kind of just say, well, I'm not sure what's going on, but, I'm confident that we can work this out. So you kind of have a more, and I mean, it's not always calm, right?
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
usually what precipitates a crisis is there's something bad happening.
Mhm.
But there's at least, you think that there's an answer, right? That there's going to be a way to work this out, that there's a way to resolve this. If you don't have that, then I think people end up kind of at sea because they don't know where to go.
Mm.
And I mean, I hate to put it this way, but it's a little bit Pelagian. It's like I got myself here through intellectual effort, and ultimately that's how I stay.
Mm.
And really, the way the process works is you identify the church through the motives of credibility, but you may not have full-blown understanding of the faith. You probably won't, right? And so this idea that you have to just think it through and get to the right answer is not consistent with that. And then even when you get there, so even if you're like, yep, I'm morally certain that this is the church, it still requires divine grace because it's a
Mm.
supernatural object. And like, even if you're like, I think that this is the object of divine, this is a plausible and believable object of divine revelation, even that wouldn't be enough because God ultimately has to be the one who opens the door to you, not whatever work you're doing and what you decide. All of that's good, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you don't want
Mhm.
your faith to be irrational, but at the same time, there's only so much work that all this rationalizing can do.
Mm.
And I think people just lose track of the fact that it's like it's not your brains that get you into the church.
Yeah.
They're the simple people, it's like knowledge puffs up.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
not the fact that you know a lot about the faith that gets you into Catholicism. And I do think that there's been a tendency in apologetics to some extent to sort of overemphasize that to the point where it really is, people are really feeling like, wow, I've got to make the right decision here.
Mhm.
And I look, I absolutely do think, like I said, you can use some sort of, if you go back, if you get away from that kind of cerebral thing and go back to basic common sense. If we were like, okay, where's the government of the church? It's like,
Mhm.
well, there's this guy in Rome that everybody says is in charge of the church, and everybody recognizes it. Even people in other religions know
Mhm.
who the Pope is,
Mhm.
right? It's that I think people underestimate how surprising that is
Mhm.
because it's not a common thing, but they'll completely discard that because they're in this like intellectual, well, I have to prove in first principles why the pope is the pope and what his role is and stuff like this. And it's like, guys, first of all, just take for granted the fact that there is a church that is called Catholic and there's a guy who's in charge of it. Because it's kind of
Mhm.
miraculous if you think about it. And the fathers would even point to that. They'd be like, well, go to the church that's called Catholic, right? Because
Mhm.
they know nobody else is going to be able to get away with it. So I think if we simplify and stop wrangling over these, like, where's exactly the boundary of infallibility and what is this? And, how does this work? It would be a much more healthy way to process kind of how
Mhm.
these things go. And to turn back to the point with Gavin Ortland,
Mhm.
that's exactly what the problem is once you convince yourself that it's like, oh, well, I have to prove this, I have to prove this from scripture, I have to prove this from the fathers, I have to prove this in some way, you're already in that intellectualizing mindset. You have no government to ground you. There's nothing normative, right? There's nothing to help your ascent of faith and to keep you stable. And so that's what happens is you just have a bunch of people just thinking whatever they want. And there are people who come into the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church thinking that the church is going to cure that, right? They're coming from that environment and they think, oh, well, this is the answer and it's going to solve all these intellectual problems and then I won't have any problems anymore. And that just denies that it's like the stability comes from divine grace and the heart, not your understanding, not your intellectual understanding. Reason's a great help. Reason and faith should work together, but they are not the same thing. And I just think a lot of people have had that experience of sort of church shopping and coming around. And it's just, and I mean, maybe you can speak to that in your experience, but I do
Mhm.
think that there's a lot of that people just underestimate how much grace is involved in
Mhm.
that process. It really, no matter how much thinking you do, there's a point at which the light just comes on.
I can totally see a person, considering rationally, okay, the motives of credibility as we were discussing. But once you come to the conclusion that the Catholic Church is the church established by Christ and the magisterium is the authority over me, You get that, you give that assent of faith, and you then submit to its teaching authority. And what needs to happen is you no longer now scrutinize everything and second guess everything in the way that you did when you came to the Catholic Church. Now that you've accepted that authority, you now submit to it. I think, however, a lot of people don't do that, and they don't stop there. They continue to now scrutinize and second guess everything that the magisterium says. And it's like, wait, did you really assent to that teaching authority? Or are you now actually sitting in judgment of that teaching authority and second guessing and scrutinizing everything that it has to say? I think that's perhaps what's taking place today with a lot of people. And that then results in them second guessing every magisterial document that comes out of Rome.
Well, yeah, I think that that's the case. And and part of it is it doesn't. So when I talk about the magisterium being a government, there are some similar limitations, right? Like people have offices in the government, they function in a certain way. So, for example, we have an obligation to give religious submission to the bishops, right? It clearly can't be the case that we can't disagree with the bishop. I mean, you can't say, well, it's like, I don't think you got this right. I think that it's the same thing with every level of the church. I mean, I think that there are things that you can look at and say, I think that there may be mistakes in this papal document. I think that there may be, I think the ecumenical council may have gotten this factual determination wrong. Like there are things that are not necessarily in the scope of, either aren't in the scope of infallibility or aren't matters that that you're necessarily going to have perfect judgment. And this is kind of the knowledge thing that we're talking about. It's like infallibility doesn't necessarily mean perfect knowledge. And if you are expecting things to automatically resolve all your questions, answer all your questions, be absolutely clear, that's not always going to happen. So there's always an opportunity to question things. It's exactly what you said. It's shifting from that position to I'm judging whether this is the right, whether this government really has authority over me. I'm judging because you can explain a lot of things, right? And like I said, I don't think that the magisterium is immune to criticism. I'm actually working on a piece about Donum Veritatis now, but I think it's not quite as broad as people say because sort of the general thing is like you can't criticize the Pope. It's like, well, I mean that's true. It's more like you can't criticize particular things that the church says, even non-infallibly, or that there are certain kinds of things. But that's actually specifically related to where do you cross the line between questioning whether the magisterium did the right thing in a specific case, which I think in some cases is legitimate, versus saying this government doesn't have authority over me, right? Versus making yourself your own.
Yeah. And wouldn't you say there's a difference between criticism and dissent?
Correct.
Like I can criticize something that is magisterial while not dissenting from it.
Right. And that's the thing is I think dissent, Donum Veritatis, it's got a nice phrase on this because it talks about judgments meant to bind the conscience. Right? So if there's a judgment that's meant to bind the conscience and the magisterium has authority, that's in dissent territory, right? It's like the judgment is meant to bind the conscience. There are other examples like discipline is another one of the examples they gave, where it's like you just have a moral obligation to adhere to this if you accept the authority, right? So this dissent, and then but then there's also legitimate criticism. And
Sure.
there are situations where, and that's what you're trying to avoid crossing the line on,
Yeah.
is you don't want to say they don't have authority. You don't want to deny the authority. That's the dissent piece. And the
Mhm.
criticism piece, it's like, if you're not dissenting,
Yeah.
you can criticize.
Sure.
But it's just that people they can't seem to get their heads around the fact that there are some things where you really are not supposed to be dissenting,
Mhm.
and some cases where you're actually free to criticize. I mean, if you
Mhm.
think that they're not doing a good job, and
Mhm.
there have been a couple of, kind of famous examples, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, Saint Catherine of Siena. The church was in bad shape in a
Mhm.
couple of times. I mean, where there was just widespread corruption. There have been bad popes, and it's like, the idea is not that we can't say. I mean, doctors of the church have
Mhm.
said you guys are not doing what you need to do, and in pretty harsh terms.
Sure.
So it's not like you can't say, I think, and I mean, we can disagree on this, but it's not like you can't say, I do not think you are running this institution in the way that God wants you to run it.
I don't
And,
think
and,
one
and
can
you
say
brought
that.
up before, like you can charge it's the charge of hypocrisy, right?
Yeah.
Like, you can charge somebody with saying, I know what you're teaching, I know what you've taught, I know what the doctrine is. You're not living it up to
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
right?
You're
The
not
way
doing your
you are
job.
running things is not living
Right.
up to it, right?
Yeah.
And so, as long as people, it's just the problem is, it's become so, like, the dissent part has become so common that you
Yeah.
almost can't give credit to it, because it's gonna they can't distinguish real criticism from, and legitimate criticism from, dissent at
That's
this
right.
point.
That's a vital distinction that I think that people aren't making, and every time I hear somebody try to justify public dissent, they always conflate it with criticism, and it's like they're fundamentally two different things.
Right.
And they'll always point to instances of criticism, Peter and Paul kind of thing, and it's like that's not public dissent. And those who are dissenting against the authority, I have to ask the question, have they really submitted to the authority? I'm not so sure, because now it sounds like we're now sitting in authority over that authority. We're sitting in judgment over it, rather than just merely criticizing it. We're now
That's Yeah.
failing to ascend. And it's like, are we really submitting to the magisterium at this point?
That's the question I have.
Hmm.
And again, this kind of intellectualizing understanding of the faith is part of it. But I it seems it seems like people are having trouble with that.
Hmm.
I think for the most part, people are staying in the lines, or at least a lot of the people that I talk to are staying inside the lines. The just out and out dissent things, I think, are on the liturgical stuff,
Hmm.
where it's like, it's kind of like, I'm sorry, but the Pope just has authority over the liturgy. This idea that, I can't change the rites, I can't regulate them. This sort of like pseudo apostolic status of, the traditional Latin mass.
Right.
That's the kind of stuff where I'm like, I think that that's just straight up dissent. and
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and a lot of a lot of what I know, John Joy has done a lot of good things, but that's the example I point to, where I think he's just rationalizing dissent in his understanding of the magisterium lately. And I hate to say that, but I do think that there are people who have crossed that line. I think that there are other people, like Larry Chapp, who's just really critical. But I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like I don't think he's over the line. I think he's just being very, very, pointed in his criticism. But I don't hold that against him. Like, I don't think that this is a guy who's not submitting to the magisterium. I think he is just saying, you guys are just running things very badly, and I'm very frustrated with it. It might be, but like that kind of public criticism, I don't mind. It's really just the, wow, he just doesn't have the authority to do this, or the filial correction where it's like, you guys are teaching heresy. That's the kind of stuff where I'm like, how do you not undermine submission to the religious authority? Like, how is that compatible with, I'm morally certain that I'm submitting to the right religious authority? I that's the stuff where I'm just like, I don't, that feels very dissenty, and I don't know how they support that.
So here's maybe one way they support it. They would suggest that the church, for instance, is leading us down a path of destruction, though not in its definitive teachings, in its non-definitive acts and disciplines. If we were to assent and obey to these teachings and prudential judgments, um, we would embrace heresy, and our souls would be in jeopardy because their um, disciplines are injurious to souls, right? We would be led down the path of destruction. Therefore, we must dissent. We
Right.
must refuse to submit because the church is teaching heresy and injuring souls.
Yeah.
What would you say in response to that?
Yeah. Well, and that goes back to the principle of indefectibility, right? The church remains indefectible, as a whole, by response to the universal government, right? Like there has to be a principle that keeps everything together, and that's the unity of faith, right? It's the government of the church. The magisterium functioning as an organ of the church. If you think of the church as a living organism, it performs this function. If you cross the line in saying that it ceased to perform the function, in a way that submission to the church could breach infallibility, and you've talked about this, the charism of safety. I think that if you cross the line, and look, it might just be a mistake on their part, because as you know, because you're writing a thesis on a dissertation on it, the not submission to the non-infallible teaching of the magisterium hasn't been dogmatized or taught explicitly in a way that necessarily people are all on the same page on. So, but I will say this: if I did it, I would feel that I was dissenting. So, I mean, maybe these guys just don't have a good grasp on some of the things that, like, Cardinal Franzlin, Garrigou-Lagrange, some of these people talked about the indefectibility of the church and what submission to religious authority means. What religious submission is. But I find it very hard to believe that that's consistent with the attitude of religious submission, where we actually need to give religious submission. And like I said, I do think, like, what we actually have to give, what I have in mind is, there's a line in Lumen Gentium 25 about religious submission in a special way to the papal magisterium. I think that applies to pretty narrowly to things that the Pope does as Pope, not as a private theologian, not, it's clearly intended to be binding. So I do think that there's a limit. Like, there are some things, even where you can disagree with Pope on other things, I think that there's a fairly narrow category of things we're not supposed to disagree on. But I do think that the way the criticisms are phrased, especially when talking about like actually teaching heresy.
Hmm.
I don't think you can say the Pope is actually teaching heresy
Hmm.
in these areas covered by Donum Veritatis and not say you're dissenting from the authority, because you're basically saying the authority ordered me to commit heresy.
Hmm.
And how can you submit to an authority that can order you to commit heresy?
I, I think they just limit then submission to merely definitive propositions, and that's it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, that's an alternative, but I just I don't think that that is a plausible alternative or understanding of the
Yeah.
church. And
You
I
actually
don't know how you read Donum Veritatis and think that your submission's limited to definitive excavators.
right. So you actually translated some of Franz Lin on this particular
I
point,
didn't. No,
according to
I
your
didn't translate.
scholarship.
I just grabbed excerpted a couple of translations that were online. So
Okay,
there are
okay.
a couple of places that translated, and there's a translation that actually has a forward by Father Ripperger. But
Yeah.
but there's a translation of Franzlin's work, and I've just read what was there.
Mhm. And you've
But
made some of those excerpts available on your
right, yeah,
blog. Yeah.
But I excerpted them in a previous article.
Yeah, and you
So
wrote some of your commentary on them too. It's again at Crimson Catholic. I'll put a link to it there in the show
oh,
notes.
sure,
It
yep.
was a few maybe a month or so ago. I'm trying to
Yeah, a couple
find,
months ago, I think.
yeah, the infallible security of papal non-definitive teaching. I'll put a link to that in the show notes too.
Right.
Um, yeah, go ahead. I think you were going to say something there.
Well, no, what I was going to say is, and I'm actually I'm working on another piece, like I said, on Donum Veritatis, but I'm going to
Hmm.
call it the circular firing squad on Pope Francis,
Uh huh.
just because I mean, I think that a lot of this is just
Hmm.
sort of basic misunderstandings and
Hmm.
having a hard time finding where that line is.
Right.
And I think when you point out that it's like, okay, you guys are probably over the line. It's like I
Yeah.
agree, there is stuff to criticize here, but there's
I
over the
agree.
line, and you need to watch out
Let me
on
give you an
being over.
example. I have some criticisms of fiducia supplicans.
Yeah,
That's not the same as public dissent, however.
right,
I have some criticisms of this entire pontificate, and I'm happy
yeah,
to discuss what they are, but that's not the same as refusing to submit to it,
yeah.
accusing it of heresy or something like that. For instance, when the biggest criticism I have of this pontificate, and it probably would be a criticism that I imagine anybody who was pope at this time would probably be vulnerable to this. I think this pontificate has failed to appreciate the impact of social media and the phenomenon of social media. And again, maybe that would have been the case even if we had somebody else like John Paul II, who is Pope right now. Maybe you could level the same criticism there to one degree or another. But I think this pontificate has failed to appreciate how social media works, how easy it is to twist people's words, run with fake news, and maybe the necessity of being aware of that so that you can do your best to minimize exploitation of your words. It's so
Well,
easy to exploit somebody's words, so what you want to do is do your best to minimize that. I know you can never just reduce people from abusing and exploiting your words, but you can make sure to avoid certain terms. Like for instance, if they had given me fiducia supplicans before promulgating it and said, Michael, hey, what do you think? What do you think the news and social media is going to do to twist this? I would have said the word couple. Just
yeah.
take the word couple out. You can describe what you're describing here as you're defining the word couple. It's all orthodox, but just describe it. Don't use that term, because here's what's going to happen: they will not define this word based on the context. They will just take that out of context and then import their own interpretation into it and then exploit you all day long on social media.
Well,
And that's exactly what they did.
well, and the problem is, and I know a lot of people like him. I think Cardinal Fernandez is all over the place He's not focused, and he's completely in this pastoral mindset. So in terms of like being a careful theologian who makes distinctions and doesn't just bloviate and doesn't say a lot of things that don't have anything to do with it. He reminds me. There's a couple of people like this, but Walter Casper. They just it's just all like they just can't help but say all of this meaningless stuff, and it's like, especially in magisterial documents, that it really confuses, because part of interpretation of magisterial documents is figuring out where they're just riffing as a private theologian, which is most of what they do, by the way. Like a lot of, if you read any lengthy document, like a lot of it's just the Pope's, private theological speculation, kind of explaining what he's thinking, right? So explaining what the Pope is thinking is not necessarily dogmatic, right? You kind of have to look at, okay, these are the things that I think should be binding on the conscience of Christians, not their explanation, not their reasoning, not their argumentation, and all this. Fernandez will write 4,500 words of reasoning and argumentation and lofty this and that, and then like the piece that is actually binding. It was the same thing with the Amoris Laetitia. It's like you got like 3 paragraphs that are binding in the whole thing, and it's this huge thing, and it's like, I get it, but it's like a giant homily, right? Magisterial documents don't do well as giant homilies.
Don't you think that we've had this problem for several hundred years? Not maybe,
Yeah.
not. I mean, for a while now with papal encyclicals,
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
overly verbose.
Anti-modernism really kicked the whole
Yeah.
thing off, where they just go off on these whole things, and then you read the whole thing, and it's like, okay, what did you say that was actually binding on the conscience?
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like, what did you say? Because I mean, it's the same thing as ex cathedra documents, right? Like legitimate ex cathedra teaching. You read the whole thing, and there's like 2 sentences in there
Right.
that
It's
say
like
this is what's
yeah.
fine, right? So this. And that's the thing, is we've gotten more and more in this. Okay, you got this huge, like, essentially homiletics, piece, and then like you get down to what they're actually changing,
Yeah.
and it's so tiny that it's like, well, what did you even do this for? And that is really like Fiducia's Supplicans is probably the the apotheosis of that approach, because I mean, you're spending all this time about this thing, and it's like, okay, yeah, basically what you're saying is exactly the same thing. You just want to be really clear that when somebody walks up to you on the street, you don't necessarily have to evaluate whether the object is within the scope of, and it's like, that's all the priests are like, yeah, we were doing that anyway.
Yeah.
So it's what you said. It's like, especially in the climate where we are, where the German, you got German bishops actually conducting public same-sex union blessings in churches. Do you really think that this is the problem that needs a document right now? Is this the guidance you want to get? Those are the kinds of things where I'm like, and I feel like I'm not dissenting by saying that's just a prudential mistake.
Oh yeah, there's criticisms in the prudential realm that we can make all day long, and of course, even when it comes to even the theological propositions,
right?
Dona Veritatis allows a person who's making a good effort, they're well informed, but they're really struggling with it. It allows them in some cases to withhold religious submission of intellect and will. But there's a difference between withholding religious submission of intellect and will and publicly dissenting. See, there's a fundamental difference. And so the very document that allows a withdrawal of religious assent in some rare cases is the same document that also condemns public dissent.
Right.
And people don't make those distinctions, and they confuse them.
Well, and Donum Veritatis, it's like, even if you're withholding, the reason you're withholding is you're like, okay, I have confidence in the authority that I can work this out, right? Like you're gonna get there. If you look at Donum Veritatis 30 and 31, it doesn't basically say, it's like, yeah, the magisterium's not going to be wrong, but we understand that you might not understand why we're right.
Right.
Or your understanding of what we were trying to say, or maybe we weren't clear.
Yeah.
So that there could be a process, not a public process, but a process to
There
get
you
you
go.
there, to figure out like why this is true. But I
And
do
it's
think
not
that if it's
public too. As
right,
you
right, right,
mentioned, it's not public, and that's
right,
what
right.
people are not catching.
And so that's what I'm saying. I mean, when you're saying, X teaches heresy, well, okay, if it teaches heresy, and you think that it's in the magisterial teaching, and like I said, if you believe that it was a private opinion, it's not part of this. But these people are asserting that there was heresy taught in the magisterial teaching.
Right.
It's like,
In the magisterium, yeah.
yeah, that's just not appropriate.
Right.
If it's matter that's supposed to be binding on the conscience, it's just not appropriate to say that that's heretical, that that's leading people into error. Overall, sure. I mean, if you want to say overall, the effect of this document is going to be, there's going to be a lot of people who are like, yeah, my state of life is fine and I don't need to fix it, which I think is the real problem. And that's why I would have said, rather than focusing on this stupid hyper technical issue of whether you could, whether people can ask for a blessing, outside of the liturgical context, it's like, guys, you have completely lost the forest for the trees. The forest is, there are a lot of people out there who are really struggling with this, have no help, and this is only going to make it worse.
And I want to note, I do think that the magisterium's failure to discipline, or failure to say something that it should in a timely manner, that can certainly harm souls. But that's more of a failure. That's more of an omission, rather than something that, the magisterium itself teaches, where now the magisterium has become a tool for destruction. Whereas in the case of failing to do something, it is not the tool of destruction. It's other external things that is the tool of destruction.
Right.
It's just, it's not doing what it needs to do to fight that issue.
And like what St. Catherine said was, God's providential help will always be with you. So, it's exactly that. Like, if you look at these disasters, it's mostly just the Pope saying, I mean, these guys are, running brothels in their diocese. Sometimes it's the Pope running the brothel in the Vatican. I mean, just really bad. That's it. It's just, it's complete failure of discipline. And one of those failures of discipline, and I think that this is going to continue to come up, is if you don't maintain your sacramental discipline, that does have collateral effects, right?
Oh yeah.
If you say, and that was why, like, with Familiaris Consortio, which, Amoris Laetitia changed, but Familiaris Consortio said, look, there's just going to be too much scandal if we let the remarried back to communion. So, I understand, like I said, I haven't been, I've talked about Amoris Laetitia before, and I do think that, maybe we do have to have a discussion about that discipline, because it's very difficult for them. Couples who are being continent, but who still can't go to communion in their parish. I understand that that's a tough area, but you do have to think about the consequences of not maintaining sacramental discipline. So for example, not refusing communion to pro-abortion politicians, right?
It's a big problem.
It sends a message, and that was before. I mean, that was happening, under Pope John Paul II and under Pope Benedict. So, I mean, I don't want to pretend that, like, lack of discipline or prudential errors like this don't really hurt people. It's just don't take that criticism so far that
Mhm.
you're denying what their legitimate authority is.
Mhm.
That's the
That's
line
fair.
where I
Yeah,
think
that's fair.
it just gets
Sure.
uncomfortable.
And again, another one of my criticisms of not only this pontificate, but probably all of the post-conciliar popes is a lack of discipline.
Yeah, yeah,
I for
I
the
think that
life
that's
of
true. I
me.
think they kind of gave up. It was really 1968 with Humanity Vitae. I think they kind of gave up
You
on the
think that's what it
idea.
was, the deal that's kind of what
Yeah,
made
it's almost like they made a truce where it's like we won't kick you liberals out of the church,
Mhm.
and you guys won't do anything completely crazy.
Hmm.
I think that that's what happened,
That's kind of
and I
when they
think we've
gave
just
up.
been living with that really lack of discipline for
Mhm.
a long time.
Another one is the speech from John the 23rd in his opening speech for Vatican II with the medicine of mercy as opposed to anathemas and stuff like that. And it's like,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
I
it,
felt
it,
like this stuff was well intentioned, but I don't know, maybe this wasn't the best approach.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think that there's something to be said for clarity, and like I said, it just the way magisterial authority works
Mhm.
is it's exercised. I mean, they even talk about, the manifest will and mind of the Pope. I mean, that's what
Mhm.
they're supposed to do. Is like
Mhm.
if you're going to do something magisterial,
Mhm.
you're going to use your authority, you need to say, this is not me as a private theologian. I'm making this binding on the conscience. This is
Mhm.
universal guidance. This pertains to the faith. It's say all of the things that say I'm using my papal office to regulate this, right?
Mhm.
That's how you're supposed to do it. And they don't want to do it because of that merciful thing, but then it's like then the magisterium, everybody looks at it, and it's like if they can't see the manifest mind and will, then they don't know. It's like, okay, well, was this intended to be binding on the conscience? Is
It
this speculation? Is it homiletics? What? And so that's creating this, and then everybody gets in all these fights because they're like, oh, that's binding, and that's not. And it's like, well, if they would just say so, then we wouldn't have to do
well, hold on though, but wait. Ordinatio sacerdotales. The Pope
right,
says so, and
right,
yet it's still put in question. It's still being
straight up.
debated. It's
Straight up. And it's like, and it's even worse there because it's like, not only was it a clear magisterial ratification of the ordinary and universal magisterium, but
Mhm.
that means it was already in the ordinary and universal magisterium, which means it's been taught so
Yeah, yeah,
clearly
yeah,
collectively
yeah,
by the bishops for
yeah,
2000 years
yeah.
that it can't even be denied.
Why is this still an
It's like,
issue?
how much do you have to pile
I
on
don't know. It's like, why is this still an
before?
issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's just comical at this point. But that's the point. Is like the magisterium just isn't. The reason that happens is because the magisterium has just been so, talking in these broad sweeps and not just
Mhm.
saying, "Look, I've got the
Yeah.
keys. This is what you're bound to."
Yeah, I would appreciate that more than these really long, verbose magisterial documents. It's
Right.
just like,
If they would just stop justifying themselves and just say, "What is it that we're bound to
yeah,
believe?"
yeah.
That would be a lot better.
That would help.
Yeah, yeah.
Jonathan, I want to thank you so much for coming on and doing this. You are welcome on the show anytime. I'd love to have you back
Yeah,
on.
good discussion. I think we got mostly off topic, but
That's okay.
that's
That's all right.
fine.
This was great.
I appreciate it. But,
Uh,
again, I think that, like, if it's this bad in Catholicism, how bad is it in Protestantism?
mhm.
Because there's no authority there.
That can
It
bind your
goes beyond
conscience.
dissent.
Yeah.
It's like you just don't have an authority at all. So even
Yeah.
the discussions we're having, you couldn't have at that level
See, here's the difference in Catholicism. Number one, the magisterium can always clarify itself more and more to the point that things are no longer in question. Whereas you can't do that with the Bible. The Bible can't clarify itself to the point where it can no longer, put certain matters into question. And number two, the magisterium binds one's conscience. Now, it's a different question if a person now dissents and no longer recognizes that authority. But if a person recognizes that authority, it binds their conscience. Um, whereas there is no magisterial authority in Protestantism that can bind your conscience. Your Protestant pastor can't tell you, "I bind you, with the keys of St. Peter to this proposition." You can't do that. And so there is a fundamental difference between the teaching authority in Catholicism versus Protestantism. And that's why I think that people, when they say, "Oh, well, there's disunity in Catholicism," they're missing the point. The disunity is precisely because these people are defying the magisterium. Whereas in Protestantism, the disunity is there isn't a magisterial authority.
Yep. Well said.
Yeah. So if people
Well,
actually started assenting to the magisterium, we wouldn't have all this disunity. Anyways, thank you so much for coming on, Jonathan. Everybody go and check out Crimson Catholic. I have a link to it there in the show notes. And again, I'll get you back on sometime, Lord willing. Everybody hit the like button and the subscribe button. Hey, put in a plug for anything else you want to make the audience aware of. Anything else you wanted to direct?
Just going to be posting on the blog. I appreciate the chance to talk through all this.
Absolutely. Okay. Everybody hit the like button and the subscribe button.